There are at least 322 listed phobias or fears. You're probably familiar with claustrophobia. That's the fear of confined spaces, feeling like you're trapped. You've probably heard of arachnophobia. That's the fear of spiders. But have you heard of brontophobia? That's the fear of thunderstorms, not the brontosaurus dinosaur. And have you heard of fee-fi phobia? That's the fear of giants. Well, that's actually made up. But welcome to the Word for 2021. Today we're in 1 Samuel chapter 17. In this chapter we have the famous account of David versus Goliath. Now the Philistines want to do battle with the Israelites. Both armies have set themselves apart from each other with a valley in between. And in verse 4, a champion on the Philistine side named Goliath came morning and evening to taunt the Israelites. He came and he was over 9 feet tall. As he approached the Israelites, they were afraid of the challenges that he made and the threats. It says in verse 11, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. In verse 24, when the Israelites saw the man, they all ran in fear of him. All but one, and that was David. Why? Because David saw Goliath differently. All the other Israelites, when they saw Goliath, they saw his size. And they talked about Goliath and his might, his armor, and what he could do. David, however, talked about what God could do. No one else talked about God, it seemed, but for David, he talked about no one else but God. In both verse 26 and verse 36, David said, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" As you read chapter 17, you'll be reading about this account and what David thought about Goliath and what David said about God. David referenced Goliath only twice, calling him that uncircumcised Philistine, but he referenced God 9 times. For David, he spoke about God's ability and who God was 9 times, but Goliath only twice. That leaves us to ask a question. In relation to David's example, how does that compare to us? What ratio do we use when it comes to talking about grace or talking about guilt? Do we talk about grace 4 times more than we talk about guilt? Or do we talk about our complaints 4 times more than we talk about God's blessings? We should talk more about hope than we do despair. We should talk about strength more than weakness, because we know that God is an ever-present help in time of trouble. As we read chapter 17, David, he amplified God, which meant that Goliath was minimized. David didn't listen to the voice of the enemy. He didn't care what Goliath had to say because David knew the voice of truth. David knew that no matter how big the problem was or the giant, God was bigger. For David, the only giant in his life was God. Now, giants can loom large. Giants can be overwhelming. Giants can be intimidating. The same could be said about problems in our lives. You might feel as though our problems are giant size when it comes to financial problems or physical problems, emotional problems, or situational problems. We need to see our problems in view of God's presence and God's power. And for David and for us, nothing compares with God. I love what Max Lucado once said. If we focus on giants, we will stumble. But if we focus on God, giants tumble. Devotional writer Henry Blackaby put it this way: the account of David and Goliath vividly pictures the source of the Christian's faith. It's not about our size, our strength, or our resources, but the power of Almighty God. If we focus on our opposition and problems, they will seem gigantic. But as we focus on God, we will see our situation in proper perspective. All things are possible with God. Thank you for joining the Word for 2021.